Tower of Babel. Fun little place. It starts off where we've got this table of nations, which is one of these in chapter 10. It's all these names. Okay, we've got names and names and names. And I'm not going to do it because I'm really bad at pronouncing all these names. And you would go to sleep anyway. But interesting things related to that is that there are times when the scripture does it, and there are some people that really get into it, and it's really cool because they associate, or they go, okay, you see this name, this is over in Ezekiel, and this name, and this one's over here, and these guys did this, and these guys did this, because it's real history. It's not just a story. It's real history, and this is the only place that some of this history is recorded. God knew that, and he wanted to make sure it was recorded properly. You have Japheth. He fathered basically Caucasians who settled in Russia and the European continent. You have Ham. They pretty much populated the African continent, and all of the ites, the Jebusite, the Amorite, the Girgashite, the Hivite, the Arkite, the Sinite, the Arvadite, the Zemarite, and the Hamathite.
And the parasite?
Yeah, exactly. So you have all the ites that gave Israel all sorts of trouble. And you have Shem being the father of the Hebrew people and the Oriental people. One of the difficulties for a young earth creationist like me is the thought of the flood and the way that those families were able to multiply fast enough, that the animals were able to disperse fast enough, that they made it onto all the continents with enough variations that happened. You know, it is interesting. That is an interesting issue. It's mathematically plausible, but just barely. Just barely. So it was kind of a special work of God during that time. But it almost didn't happen, because the people came out of the ark and they were quite satisfied. They were a family. They had, sons and daughters and things, but they were pretty happy with life, and they were hanging out together, and they all spoke the same language, and they all knew each other, and they were all happy with each other. And then they started going, okay, well, yeah, this is pretty good, and we'll keep hanging out together. And they started building a tower, which was probably a ziggurat, a temple of worship. Already, they're starting to fall into not so good stuff, probably worshiping the stars and the zodiac. And astrology and the zodiac and what we have is actually corruption from the original zodiac called the Mazareth. God himself refers to the Mazareth in the end of Job, and there's another couple places. And it was basically the original constellation. It was the original things, and you can actually follow and look through, and it's very similar. It's only been changed in just a few areas, few important areas, but the story of the gospel is in the original Nazareth, not in Satan's corruption. Makes sense. But it was actually dangerous. It wasn't only that they were going in the wrong direction, and they were getting very prideful about what they could do. It was very dangerous for humanity to stay in this small area. That if a plague happened, you could wipe out all of humanity. Whereas if you're dispersed, you have more time to preserve. And so you can have a plague in Europe and have America survive or whatever. So we have God specifically did that tower. Now there is an interesting one. Right near the end of chapter 10, we have verse 25, to Eber was born 2 sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. What does that mean? The earth was divided. Some people will say that this is referring to the splitting of the continents, the beginning of Continental Drift. This helps issues like how do you get animals in the United States, or in North America, as opposed to the Middle East, if they're all one continent, and then in those days they drifted apart. That would be a huge upheaval, though. There are problems with that, in the sense that would be a huge upheaval. Now, it's easy to see that it started, and maybe the distance between the continents wasn't as great, in the early days, making it easier for people to get there. But that would help that issue. The best research, and one of the places my go-to places for pretty good scholarly research, is the Institute for Creation Research, ICR. And they they think that continental drift is better associated with the flood. That the amount of energy needed and weight and everything else to force the continents apart is better associated with the flood.
Saying that that's when it happened?
Yeah, that's when continental drift started. That's what kicked it off. That's what changed it from, it does look like there was one continent, but that's what started to force it apart. Likely it refers to the splitting of the nations at the Tower of Babel. So that's why it's related to the tower.
Could it be one of those things where it talks about the being divided and then it goes back and gives more description?
Mm-hmm, exactly.
God created the heavens and the earth and it goes back and tells you.
Exactly. You're going to find that over and over and over again in the Old Testament. That's a very Hebrew Eastern way of looking at things. For Western logic, we tend to go A, then B, then C, then D. For Eastern logic, it's very much more, oh, this is interesting, and here's another take on it, and here's another take on it, and here's another take on it. And then you put that all together into one complete picture.